All right, we're live, and right now I have Jonathan with us. Connor's going to join us in a few minutes. Little housekeeping note: I may have to walk away for just a minute in about 20 minutes, but I'll still be able to hear. And it should only take a minute. But so today we're going to talk about God. It's not going to be a Bible study, but more of the psychological, philosophical, not maybe so much metaphysical, although I would like to, if possible, talk about how basically it's like there's like a sort of dual nature to like metaphysical, psychological, and then, so in other words, like we may at sometimes wrestle with the idea of the metaphysical aspect of God, but we can always keep in mind the just pure psychological and practical aspect of God. So we'll talk about that a bit. I posted a few things in the last 24 hours or so on those lines, a little bit from Jordan Peterson and also from Yuval Noah Harari's Sapiens. And so we'll talk about that a little bit. I'm going to try to hear a little bit more from Jonathan or his perspective, because as well as Connor once he gets on, and maybe even another person. But I have been hoping to get a little better understanding from others who have that other perspective of, or even just a more, I don't know if I'd say cynical, but skeptical perspective of the thing, and then just a better understanding of how we deal with so many unknowns and so much that we just have to kind of do a sort of walk by faith almost, just because there's so many unknown variables in life that we just kind of progress forward anyway. So yeah, Jonathan, let me just kind of hear your thoughts for a minute or two or whatever, and then we'll just see where it goes. I don't know how long this one will go today, and we may get into some of the other topics that we've been on recently.
Sure. And I hope Connor can make it, because
Yeah.
he and I butt heads on this a lot.
Okay.
So I wanted to try to hopefully get him here if he can.
Yeah, and let me know where you guys kind of butt heads too, because I mean, that's an interesting thing to me, is to kind of like understand all the different perspectives on some of these complicated issues, and then understand where the conflict is, and if there's a way to kind of have a better understanding. But go ahead.
Right. Maybe I should preface that. So let me start first by sort of giving my frame of reference.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I grew up in a fundamentalist home, left religion, and that story is probably reproducible for many people. So I study math, and my philosophical standpoint is what you would call agnosticism, which is, it's not agnostic. It's similar, but it's essentially a philosophical version of requiring that your definitions are coherent. So, in other words, I don't claim to have a concept of God unless someone gives me a coherent definition beforehand. So, for example, to sort of drive home the point somewhat facetiously, I could define God to be a chair. Now, you might think, okay, that's a ridiculous definition. But if you pick 3, let's say, religious people in the world, all 3 of them will probably have different conceptions of God, some of which might be mutually disjoint from one another, contradictory. So while you might say some definitions aren't useful ones to talk about, I would say that the first thing to get right is to have a concept of God. So I don't necessarily want to debate the semantics of it. I would rather debate the concept. So that's why I would argue that we should try to divorce the word God from our language and instead talk about concepts like first causes or the highest value in the hierarchy of values, things like that. So that's sort of my approach, if you will. and I am sympathetic sort of to the atheist cause. But in any case, Connor and me usually butt heads on the topic of mythology somewhat. I'm not exactly sure what the disagreement is, because every time we start talking about it, he starts. It usually devolves into an interpretation issue. So we'll disagree on how we're actually interpreting scripture, or I'll not be sure what his interpretive algorithm is. And so I usually try to take it from a just face value, which I know is very simplistic. I'm open to other, ways of extracting interpretations from the text, but I'd like to hear more, if he gets on here, about what algorithms he's using to get interpretation from biblical text, Islamic text, things like that. So that's where I would stand on that. I'll be happy to hear from him if he can make it.
Yeah, he'll probably be here in a few minutes. Let me see. Let's just hear from Radu for a minute, and then Radu, who just got here, I'll just say we're kind of talking about the just the concept of God. And Jonathan, you were just saying about how, like, I forget the exact terminology you just used, but how, like, you want to have things in certain terms that make sense, I guess. But before we go to Radu, let me just have you clarify that a little bit. Like, for you personally, for your experience, when you deal with these things such as first causes, highest values, those kind of things. So I guess one, because I think of it kind of like I think of a lot of things in like a dual nature. So, like, at least for that aspect of something like that, it's like, one, what is it to you personally, those concepts, and so a little more detail on that. And then the other is just as other people have their concepts, what is more like acceptable to you or unacceptable? Because I think that's kind of where we need to. So it seems like yours it has to do with coherency, and then I would just say too, I do find the agnostic approach interesting, but for me, that same sort of way of looking at it, because agnosticism with the I, as you put it, it's more of saying it's like saying you can't really have a concept of God because it's too abstract and complicated, just to put it very simply, I guess. But I'll let you clarify that in a minute. But I would just say that because it's such a thing that we've wrestled with for basically all of known human history, it makes it more of something to continue to wrestle with, not necessarily to say we've got to do it the way that it's always done, probably update the way that we deal with the concept. But I would say that, and just that's just the reality. Like I've said before, we're always going to have religion and some form of God in the world, whether that's however you want to define it. But let me hear from you on clarify that before.
No, sure, yeah. Okay. Let me make sure I lay this down right. So
sure, I'm listening.
It's a background issue. So I'm used to doing proofs. I'm used to doing things like making sure a definition is well defined. And in math, it happens all the time that you might put forward a definition, and it turns out that your definition isn't even sensible. You might say, well, I'm going to define this object, and it turns out that object doesn't even exist. And that happens a lot. It happened a lot in the 1800s when George Cantor came up with set theory. He realized that the naive approach, just defining a set to be anything you can stick an object in, ended up having contradictions. This happened in the measure theory, where people were trying to figure out how to calculate the sizes of objects that were fractals, and they discovered that there is no algorithm for it without some kind of restriction. So I wouldn't say that people don't have concepts. I think you can have concepts without a definition. I think the point is, because I don't know what another person's concept is, my expectation for something like a definition of God is I can't know what your concept is in any coherent sense unless you give me some kind of sensible definition. But people carry concepts with them all the time without doing this, right? People might not have a definition of God, and they still picture some kind of light in the middle of nothingness, or a singularity, or, you know, they'll have concepts like that, like in the Muslim faith or in the Christian faith. They'll have images in their head. You might call them archetypes, for instance. They'll have archetypical representations of what they might call God,
or symbolic,
right? Or symbolic ones. And Christians sort of reduce this down to the most concrete you can get, which is God is a man, Jesus, right? So that Christians, Jews, people, many different religions do this differently. And so my issue is, if I'm going to sort of understand what you're saying and put it back to you in your own terms, I don't feel comfortable doing that without some kind of definition to work with that's at least sensible or coherent. And because everyone carries different concepts of God with them, it's a good exercise to say, what do you mean by God? That's one of the most important exercises someone can do for themselves if they do believe in God. So that's why I think the approach is useful. I would say in that case, I'm a weak agnostic, because guys like I think, what's his name? Penn from Penn and Teller. He criticized agnosticism by saying, well, people have concepts without rigorous definitions. Like, yes, they do. But that doesn't, if you don't have a rigorous definition, or at least a sensible one, it's not straightforward how to extrapolate consequences from that. And so that's why I would expect something like that provided.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing. I mean, because, okay, so like if you have, and so this kind of puts it in scientific terms almost, where, okay, like if you have a gallon of water, you know, you can measure a lot of different ways as far as what the H2O is, and then you can just say that's a gallon of water, it's this much H2O and all that. Whereas if you take that, there are other things that are not so objective like that. So like if you take 1 million people, or even just 1,000 people, and you say, let's look at this sunset together and tell me what it is and describe it to me, you'll get, even though it's the same exact thing of just this sunset in this moment, or just a landscape in nature, or whatever, just some landscape, they will give you, you know, there will be commonalities among them, but there'll also be like 1,000 different ways, which I think is really important to kind of understand it from that perspective, just because understanding what potentially a concept like God is something like trying to understand some of these other abstract things, like what money is, what Google is, what a country is, you know, all these things that are, or what a democracy is. You know, if you ask 1,000 people to tell you what those things are, they can give you certain definitions and certain measurements. And the reason sometimes it's good to have those kind of examples too is because it's more about how you interact with it. So like I said, the example of a gallon of water, it's just that much H2O. But if you say what a landscape is, or what a corporation is, or what a country is, or what democracy is, it's more about how you and individuals interact with it, and not just in like one slice of time, but over all of time, or, you know, at least the known imaginable time. So yeah, it's tricky, and we could be on that for a while, but we'll get into it. But let me just, Jonathan, have you kind of say like what that is for you more specifically, and then we'll hear a little bit from Radu, and hopefully Connor will jump on too.
What's the specific question?
So when you gave your position, it was mostly about how you how it is between you and other people, the concept.
Right. My approach to knowledge. Right.
Right. So I guess what I'm trying to get from you briefly is like if I ask you what you specifically personally believe, then what do you put there? And even if it's just in terms of, like you said, first causes, highest values, or something maybe like faith or whatever. Like what do you put there uh, as far as how it is for you personally that you interact with those sort of ideas or definitions in your own personal perceptions?
Okay. Well, I guess the best way to answer that would be I would just discuss them and think about them. I wouldn't use the term God. I don't feel compelled to use the word God
Mm,
for any thing, any concept.
mm,
Except, well, there are some obvious ones. Like, for example, it's hard not to call Allah a god,
mm,
right? It's hard to divorce the word God from that.
mm,
But if you do, you can try it. But of the things that I think do exist and are meaningful, none of them I feel compelled to call God. That's the way I would approach it. I don't think
okay.
I don't think that classifies me as an atheist. I think that
Mm,
classifies me as an agnostic, because if someone come up to me, actually yesterday, we had a good conversation with was it Raymond? I believe his name was. Uh, I could have the name wrong. I'm awful with names. We had a conversation in the Daily Archetype comment section where
oh,
he was talking about how his definition of God was God is the totality of existence,
yeah.
sort of. And that's fine. I'm fine with that definition, because that's just take everything that exists, that
Mm,
set is God, and that's a definition. And then
mm,
you can talk about that. That's a fine definition. Someone else might have a different definition. And so my dictionary with the word God, because the word God has been used in so many different cultures, in so many circumstances, in so many ways, I've decided to just relegate the term to whoever's using it. And so that's not quite what the topic today is. The topic today is how the concepts of God are related to values and ethics, and maybe
mm.
that might be what
Yeah.
with that. So that's not precisely what we're talking about, but the way I would talk about that is
Mhm.
here are concepts that people call God, and here's how they're related to values and ethics and morality. That's I would just try to divorce the word God from it, if at all
Yeah.
possible, unless that was what the person was using. So
Um. So we talked a little bit about this in the group. How Jordan Peterson gave an interesting sort of personal definition, since he's kind of in that in between camp, I guess, of like doesn't say he believes in a metaphysical God necessarily,
right,
but
that goes back to that word we're forbidden to use.
well, yeah, well, it's tricky because there's a lot of things that are that way. They're just really hard to define, but people operate that way anyway. People will use those words even though it's kind of messy doing so. Uh, but anyway, let me just kind of get your perspective. I think you read this yesterday, uh, and then we'll hear from Radu. And so this is kind of like a thing that Jordan Peterson posted a couple weeks ago. He said, "My God is the spirit that is trying to elevate being. My God is the spirit that makes everything come together. My God is the spirit that makes order of chaos and then recasts order when it becomes too limiting. My God is the spirit of truth incarnate." So I guess that's kind of an important distinction, a little bit from the one you were mentioning, where it's just like everything, because, and I can see that perspective too, but uh, sometimes it's good to kind of distinguish, like there's some things that are God, and then there's some things that can kind of uh, be like a God, but basically it's like I guess the main thing to that is about being truth incarnate, and it's about how that truth comes into our consciousness, and how that we grow in a better understanding of truth over time, and how to bring that into being. And then I'll just clarify too that we'll talk a little bit about values and ethics and everything, how that they come together. But I titled this the Battle of the Gods, just because that's kind of what I wanted to get in a little bit more, if we can, is just the understanding of how there's these different ideas that will always be recurring of things that are godlike, and what we do with those and how that we behave. Because a lot of times people will say this or that about what God is or is not, but then they'll behave kind of a different way. But anyway, let's hear from Radu real quick on some of this, and then maybe we'll get a little bit more clear on these things as we go. Radu, so let me get just your perspective on things, and then we'll just see where it goes. And by the way, I have to handle something really quick with the door, but I'll be able to hear you guys, who just keep talking, and I'll be right back.
Yep.
Cool. In my idea, you can't talk about God without talking about belief in God. God is a belief system, because you cannot have an objective proof. Like you said, it's an agnostic, right? The human brain is limiting by its whole purpose is to limit the soul in my imagination, so that you can have a personal experience and find out the truth for your own self. So that's why it has to be a personal experience. It cannot be an objective thing like math or measuring a quantity of molecules in a jar. It can't be that simple. Everyone has to find their own path to what God is, and the first step to doing that is to believe in it. If you don't believe it, then you're just like Thomas the doubting, right? You have to put your finger to see, and once you touch it and you see it with your own eyes, with your own senses, that's when you'll believe it. That's basically the atheist perspective, right? I'll know when I see it. If I see an angel, then I'll say angels are real. If I see an alien, then aliens are real, right? So whatever I see with my senses is real. But atheists forget that perception. You can't trust your own perception, right? And you can't trust your own experience. Your mind plays tricks on you. Your senses are not always truthful, and they may deceive you. So you can't use that as a tool to find truth. You can't use your senses to find truth. That's why you have to appeal to a higher power in order to really find truth, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I would just say on that there's a lot that what do you call it? Just falls out of that empirical range, and that's where there's a lot of examples over the centuries. Maybe one of the more notable ones is like Plato's cave, where he talks about how we can come to a certain understanding of things, but other people that might have their own understanding won't want to let go of what has been their understanding for so long, and so they will I
would call it conditioning. We're conditioned in a certain way, and it's very difficult to change our ways. We're habitual beings. Right. We get into these habits, and it's very hard to break a habit.
Yeah, and I would just say that on that, there's okay. So to try to like give the timeline of how that we understand the world, roughly speaking, when we're born, we're toddlers. We have no idea what's going on. Of course, we barely have any grasp on reality at all, and even in terms of our own senses or how to operate in our own body. Now, from the time of approximately birth up until becoming an adult, we try to figure out what our place is in reality, especially us individually in the physical reality and the social reality. Now, so when you get somebody who's a, let's say, teenager or young adult, someone in their teens or 20s ish, they had just gone through, about a couple decades of figuring out how to make their selves fit into the social fabric of the world, because that just happens by brute force practice over that period of time. And then they think they've got it. They think, okay, even if they may or may not have a concept of God or metaphysics or whatever, what'll then usually happen is, as they really get into the world, challenging their values, challenging the way that they look at things, the way that not everything can be perceived or understood, purely from an empirical perspective, then they start to oftentimes look at things for a deeper perspective, for a deeper understanding, because the purely empirical, purely objective only like gives you like one layer, one dimension, one like depth of reality, when there's a lot more to it on the psychological, something like metaphysical, and just all these things that we can't explain. So some people, I don't know, most people, give or take, will just get stuck in the way that they have, whether they had a religious background or a non-religious background or whatever. And this is what'll happen too a lot of times when, someone's like Jonathan, who and some of the other people like Jesse, I think, who grew up in a religious organization or in a religious family, but then at some point it's like, this isn't lining up, like this doesn't make sense, and then go down sort of like a different way of looking at the world. And then I think that process is something we all go through at some point, or we're at least kind of like given that call to adventure to sort of like re-examine the way that we look at things, or not just take things at face value, or just accept them because that's what our family said or whatever. So and again, I kind of look at the example of things like to understand what something like government is, or understand something like what a corporation is, or even one in particular, whether, like, sometimes you've all know what Harari will give the example of, like, okay, what's Google, or what's I think the one example he gives a lot, he names a specific French car company, Peugeot, I think, in his Sapiens, his first big book. But so, like, there's a car company. We'll say Ford Motor Companies. It's like, what is Ford Motor Companies? Is it the cars? Is it the buildings? Is it the people? Those are parts of what Ford Motor Company is, but in reality, it's a mental. I don't know if I was. It's a psychological. It's a psychological entity for a couple different reasons. One is its own legal entity, because it has its own legal rights as a corporation, different from any of the people in it. But also, if, like, you had somebody could snap their fingers, and then all the cars, all the buildings, and all the paper, and the people who worked at Ford, for example, disappeared, would Ford have gone away? Yes and no. Sure, those aspects of it would, but we've seen it happen a lot of different times in different ways in our history, where corporations will go away and they'll come back. It's because it's still in our mind. So the concept of God, it's a lot like that, where it's this idea in our mind that we use to fill in the gaps of all the mysterious things, whether you want to call that higher powers, first movers, first principles, highest values, and that how that we experience that is going to be through our own life experience and through talking to each other and everything else. But it's something that you experience, just like with so many things like government. You can list a lot of things that it is, but it's not like defining what a gallon of water is. So yeah, sorry if I'm a little distracted. but yeah, so there's always going to be these ideas of what's religious and what's God or godly or godlike, and that's going to change over time, and the idea is not going to go away probably ever, at least not for the foreseeable centuries. And so it's what I always try to do is just deal with the idea that there's always going to be these different perspectives on those things, whether you want to call that metaphysics or spiritual. And I know, Jonathan, sometimes you don't want to use the word God, but sometimes we sort of have to, just because so many people, it's just part of our lexicon, and so it's tricky because it's just non-empirical, but it's in our everyday experience, like so many things. Like there's so many things that are in our everyday constant experience, and they're non-empirical, but we're constantly filling in those gaps of like, this is non-empirical, this you might call psychological, or it's just like everybody, maybe not everybody, but the vast majority of people, regardless of what that they say on an ongoing basis is their religious affiliation or their relationship with God, they'll at times go through an experience where they like pray or want to pray or call out, so it's in our everyday experience, no matter what. So, but I don't know. I want to hear, but go ahead.
I was just going to say that there's a main problem for science to be reconciled with religion. As far as I know, the scientific method is to put a space between the observer and the observed. Like if a scientist watches something through a microscope, he needs that microscope to act as an interpreter for him to see what's going on, right? You take away the microscope, which is the objective tool, which helps everyone see the same thing, and you can't see the virus or whatever, it's too small, right? So you can't find a tool to see God, in my opinion. I don't think that's possible, because what you're measuring is not something outside. It's not an experiment. You're trying to measure something that's inside you. You're the measurer and the measurement. There's no way you can do that using the scientific method,
right?
In my opinion.
Yeah, and I would say that there, like I said, there's a lot of examples like that where it ties into what we make our behaviors as. Like if, like I say, sometimes we think of a corporation or the government. It's like everybody thinks of the government as a certain thing, or our United States democracy, for example. Certain things might come to mind, whether that's our Constitution, certain buildings or monuments, but in the end, it's all just psychological agreements. I don't know if I'd call them psychological constructs, possibly, but psychological ideas that we have sort of agreed to behave a certain way with. And, that was a bit different 100 or 200 years ago, and that'll be a bit different in another 100 years. But that it's not something you can exactly measure. Now, I kind of use that as an example too, because that's one form of our ideals, which used to kind of be more how the society in general would say, like let's measure our ideal or our behavior against this religious text, whether it's the Bible or another one, or let's measure our behavior or our ideals against this organization or these preachers or this idea of God. And now we do that with different things, whether that's our job, our university, our government. We do it all the time where we're like, oh no, look, the founding fathers said it was this way, and look, on our company's mission statement it's this way. So that's not to say exactly that those things are gods, but they kind of are in a different way. And again, it's kind of like the highest value sort of principle where there's always going to be a way that will behave in terms of, okay, like we're involved in like a lot of different corporations. Like, okay, some people will say, I don't want to go to Chick-fil-A, or I don't want to go to Starbucks because they take this or that position on, gay rights. And there's a lot of other corporations with those kind of things. And so what it is that there are all these organizations, all these ideas that we choose to how that we're going to participate with them based on our higher values and higher principles. But I don't know. I want to hear a little bit more about. I want to hear a little bit more from Jonathan and kind of how these ideas fit with him personally and specifically, compare and less of just like how to talk to with other people about it.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. The whole Chick-fil-A thing. I remember when that first blew up, and that was an interesting fiasco in and of itself. Yeah. But there are things, behaviors, values, things that people elevate that they might not call a god, but they would treat it in the same way that a religious person who's devout might treat God. Another term for it, which I might even be a little more sort of malleable to, is the word sacred. Right. Okay. So you might say, for instance, if you're a Christian, that Jesus in the church, that's something sacred, right? Right. But you could generalize that, right? So a corporation, their income, that's sacred, right? If you touch that, if you mess with that, then it's over. So people definitely have different things that they would call sacred along their hierarchy of values.
Yeah, it's interesting along those lines. The more that we think about it nowadays, because the other day I gave the example, and this is something I wanted to kind of talk a bit more about. Not so much today, but as we get more into political things, is that I think where we need to find our solutions politically more and more is non-governmental answers. The reason I mentioned that is just because I gave the example the other day of how, like, Elon Musk, for example, he has a lot of things that he holds as high values. Like, we need to be on Mars, and we need to be solar powered and electric cars and all this for his higher values. And now a lot of people could have taken those same situations of like, oh no, I see this problem in the world that needs to be solved, and just go and hold signs in front of the White House or wherever else, like, hey, we need to reduce carbon emissions and everything else. But of course, he's kind of like a rare example because he's like a billionaire and a genius probably. But Jordan Peterson often gives this other example that's very similar, where there's this kid, I forget where he's, I think he's from a Scandinavian country, but he was like a teenager a few years ago when he got this idea of how he saw a problem in the world, that there's all this plastic in the oceans, and he got this and he was trying to just figure out what he could do about it. And then I guess he saw how, I think, stingrays, they go like across the top of the water, and the thing is all the, like, almost all the plastic, or like the vast majority, is just kind of floating on the top of the ocean. So he got the idea that if you build this device similar to the way that a stingray just kind of sometimes will skim across the top of the ocean when it's swimming, then it would be able to get the plastic. Anyway, so basically, instead of going out and screaming and holding signs and making a bunch of, protests, not that we should never do that, but rather than putting all that energy into something, he found solutions based on, higher value principles, you might say. And we do this all the time with things that we see in the world, problems, values, things that we want to come about in the world. And I give these examples just because the most ideal thing is to just find ways to make them manifest in reality, make them manifest in the world. And I think we'll more and more do that in our practice in our world, but more and more of those things happen through corporations now. Like the example I was thinking of too is Facebook is like all the time, like taking down Trump ads. They're like doing certain things to kind of like control the political narrative the way that they think they can. And of course, it's a big thing now with certain things getting canceled for woke culture or whatever. But so it goes into the same thing of like people put up their values, things that they might sort of deify or look as divine or whatever, and then that's why I say it's kind of like a battle of gods, because then we can put forth these ideas and then see what happens. Some people are going to be like, okay, maybe that's a good idea, but it's a stupid way that you're doing it, or whatever. And that's how it's like a battle of ideas, or battle of these like invisible forces.
Right. Another way to say that is that people might care about the same thing, but their solutions look totally different. It's sort of like the difference between that guy that you mentioned who cleaned the plastic up and say Greta Thunberg is, well, Greta, they both might care about the same problem, and they might both care passionately, but their solutions for it they look radically different. And a lot of the, conservatives sort of made fun of Greta and her methods, which, I mean, there's plenty of things I disagree with her about, especially getting rid of planes and cars. That's kind of crazy. But yeah, it's the issue is people. I've thought about this before. Like, okay, but another example is if what's going on when conservatives say abortion is murder and liberals say, oh well, no, you can't tell women not to have an abortion. That's restricting women's rights. It's like, well, both seem to be caring for human life. There seems to be a care about human life and human liberty of life, but what they extrapolate from that are they look so different that you could say they're almost opposites. But it seems to me that there's something deeper sort of underlying those, what would you call it? Those derivations, those derivations of those values to higher order values, making derivations to sort of lower order derivative values. Like say, caring about women's rights is important because we should care about human rights, and caring about a fetus that's in the 25 weeks and can feel pain, that's important because we care about human rights. So both we should come up both for the same reason, and they diverge because of the whole tribalism problem. So
and the tribalism, it's a really fitting word, because it's almost like separate religions, because they go to such separate extremes. And such, it's almost like massively opposing mythologies, where in the middle, if you took at least 80% of people from both parties, or both who are maybe what they would call pro-life or pro-choice, you know, at least probably something between 60 and 80% of pro-choicers wouldn't say you should have an abortion, you know, 9 months in or
Right.
8 months in, and then on the other end, the pro lifers, you know, it's like it gets fuzzy on where that line is, because probably the vast majority of them will at least say the morning after pill is okay, and at least the, you know, contraception is okay. And, you know, so on both ends, it's like, okay, where do you come together? So something between a few days or a few weeks, they could probably agree that it's okay. So yeah, and that's why I say it's like more people are alike than separate, but we focus on the poles, you know, the differences. And whereas, you know, what I always try to do is figure out, okay, how can we focus on what's the same and then move forward with it? And then, you know, because like there's so much we want to get done with government or whatever. And if we focus on what we agree on, we can get a lot of things done on what we agree on. And then kind of like put on the back burner those things that are more hot button that aren't going to really change anytime soon.
Right.
But
if we can find things to agree on, right?
Yeah, well, and that's the tricky thing is finding out.
It's democracy. You will never agree. It's a majority rule. So.
Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, there's always going to be certain things that we will definitely agree on. At least the vast majority of, you know, sane individuals. Then there's always going to be and that will include not just the way that things are, but goals we should have. And then if we figure out, okay, what do we disagree on? Like, okay, let's see if we can get a better understanding of what a fetus is, for example. Let's see if we get a better understanding of, you know, like we mentioned last time we were talking, instead of just saying like, okay, we're going to destroy the world if we don't all like stop using coal power or whatever, we could try to come to something more of an understanding of, okay, let's trim that back, you know. So it's about figuring out where we can come together. And then again, it's almost like a what do you call it, like, let's try to show it doesn't move, but no, it's supposed to, that image was like the what do you call it, it's like a battle of the gods idea, which is, it goes back to, you know, Greek mythology, because it's the same thing of like the mental projections or the ideas battle out, just like you see in the free markets. Some businesses will become super successful, maybe even too much so, and some will fail. You know, 80% of businesses fail in the first 18 months. So it's like a battle of ideas that's always going on.
Well, that's the important question, is can we actually flush out common values? I mean, so one of the problems and one of the reasons I mentioned tribalism is it's probably not impossible in principle to get those common values throughout society, but it might be impossible pragmatically. So just one thing that comes to mind, for example, is I watched a discussion with Heather Hying, Brett Weinstein's wife, talking about how males and females are different. And a bunch of SJWs just stormed out of there and called her a Nazi. And it's like, well, how in the world did they derive someone stating a biological fact with no Nazis on our streets? Well, it has not. Well, they probably have certain values about maybe valuing transgender individuals, which is a derivative of valuing human life, which I think we all agree on. But the cult that they've created around that value has been they're worshiping the religion more than the value itself. In other words, so it's sort of the same. It's sort of the Pharisee problem all over again. Right. And so you can play that game with, you know, alt-right or, you know, cult, whatever sort of extreme direction you want to go in. You can play that game of there's probably underlying values that are probably more fundamental, that when you get derivatives of them and you make a cult out of them, suddenly you're no longer focused on the value, you're focused on the cult. And that's why I mentioned the tribalism thing, is if we're going to have to get past that before we can even think about finding these common values.
Right. I feel like, okay, I posted a few things on this last week or two with all this BLM stuff going on, that if we're going to have what would you call it, like societal progress or democratic progress, or things along those lines, we have to really, really value nonviolence. And the reason is because violence is something natural in our animal nature. When people are upset, it's like, all right, let them, mess shit up, whatever. And it's in our animal nature, but it's almost like, okay, is a pornography company a good company because they make a lot of money? Or, and I'm not saying we should mandate pornography or not or anything, but so that's like an example. You can think of other, like even Wall Street, you might say, they probably shouldn't be so powerful and so successful looking when they don't give a lot of value to the world, so I say that because it's like, okay, in a democracy or in the culture, it's like sometimes we're like, oh, people are doing that, people are getting on board with that, it must be a good thing, so it's like people are they want to be violent, so let's let them do it. Especially if to say that they shouldn't be violent, somebody might say I'm racist, so keep it up, guys. Like with a lot of the whole like BLM movement, it's like everybody agrees Black Lives Matter. What we disagree on is the method of how some people want to put that message out. So you have to sacrifice the propensity to violence to get a much higher order principle. So like that's why I made the point a couple times with Martin Luther King Jr. We would not have the civil liberties and the somewhat high level of equality, or higher level of equality, at least compared to the 60s or 50s, if it wasn't for the nonviolent movements led by Martin Luther King Jr. And so, yeah, like we've got to always do those. It's like the same thing with, what a God is. Like, okay, so you believe in God, whoever you are. Bob Smith, you believe in God. Well, if you're going to believe in God, that's cool. If it can also go along, if it's going to go along with these principles of, valuing human life, nonviolence as much as possible, and those kind of things. So it's like, so whatever high value that you have, whether it's whatever it might be, equality, Black lives, and everything, sure, everybody agrees on that. But then how do you bring that message about? Same thing with Allah, in the Muslim faith. It's like, okay, guys, if you want to have your Muslim faith, absolutely, we believe in freedom of religion, but you have to really coalesce on the idea of nonviolence. And then we could probably learn a lot from people in that faith if they can come against their violence and move away from violence and move away from some of the other things like the misogyny and those kind of things.
Islam probably needs a reformation first, but yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and I think they're starting to go through that, sort of like some of the ones that Christianity and some other faiths had gone through. But that's the whole thing of you see it even in the corporate world. Like when we're over time, we've kind of like maxed out where we want to say that everything's about profits. Like it's tricky because for a long time, the only option was you had to be like a for-profit company or a non-profit company. There's these relatively new corporations that are, I forget what they're called now, and they're not in all states, but it's like corporations that can go out and seek profits, but they're not beholden to the stockholders, because it's like a hybrid of nonprofit and for-profit, like a charitable type organization. They might have something charitable that they're doing, but they can still be profitable. And I think that's how that our values sort of evolve, and however that we put them into place. What do you think, Radu?
I disagree that our values should evolve. I disagree it's an evolution of values. Like it's called progress, right? An evolution of values. Yeah. And democracy is the safest route because it's the slowest way to progress, right? Because you have the majority, and many times they don't agree, so nothing gets done. So this is the safest thing we can have to slow down progress, so we don't destroy ourselves. That's the only thing going for democracy, right? In my opinion. But if you imagine the value system as being an evolutionary system, like it evolved, yes, it evolved, but many times it can evolve negatively. It can have defects by its evolution. It just grows in a wrong way, and we know some examples of that. So shouldn't we try to find a different way than just blindly trying to see what works and trying to see common values? Like you say, I don't agree in common values. Why do you want to put people together? How does this work?
Well,
if you want people to be non-violent in America, right? A non-violent movement starts in America. Would they take over a state like Chaz, like take a small city area and say, in this area we're being non-violent from now on? How would that actually work in practice?
Oh no, so it's cultural movements. So like and the reason I give the example sometimes of Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi is because they were making movements that were they had to constantly make their own people not be violent. So they had to change the culture to one that was going in a violent direction to go in a non-violent direction, and to do so just through speaking.
That's a big problem. You can't do that. You can't force people.
No, it's
even
not,
if you just do it. It's not even just by speaking. Even if you're just speaking about non-violence, people will often misinterpret you and be violent. Both these guys met violent deaths.
Right. But and there are other examples, and I don't think that means that, because they meant violent deaths, that
it's makes because they were preaching nonviolence, and someone misinterpreted that, and I'll show him.
No. It wasn't that they misinterpreted it. It's that somebody completely disagreed with it, and that wasn't a misinterpretation. But what that happened was in both those cases, and there's other examples, is it made change in the culture to where there's less propensity towards violence. And it's just an example, and I say through speech, and not through government mandates so much, or things where you're going to force outcomes, but to where you influence each other, and then over time. And I mean, we see that even now in our culture, where everybody's like so against the police and so against anything violent, and sometimes people try to put a stop to the NFL or certain things that happen in the NFL because of the violent nature of it, or certain fighting type sports because they're anti-violent. And I don't agree with that. It's because it's more of like so it's like ideas competing in the culture, and there's other things as far as sometimes we think about, like, for example, of how like our religious texts, the Bible, for example, has been interpreted over the years, but that is a relatively brand new phenomena that everybody can just go have a Bible. That's only been around for about 400 years that everybody could just get a Bible, but like barely that. It was canonized in early 1600s, and so that's like a brand new thing, and it's not like everybody needs to have a Bible, but the important thing about that principle is before everybody could pick up and read, whether it was the Bible or the Constitution or whatever other text, everybody just had to kind of like take the leader's word for it. So like one thing that's changing a lot over time is our propensity towards literacy. Like, a few hundred years ago, everybody was just fine with being farmers and let certain leaders be literate and tell them what to do. But because we're more and more literate with all of our things, whether it's history, like it's important that everybody is historically literate and knows it's good to know what religious texts are about, at least a basic idea, so people can't say it means this when it doesn't mean that. So it's just over time the culture changes, and it's tricky to use terminology like evolution of values or evolution of things, but it's just that over time things change, and and that's what we've always got to do, and check it against truth. Like in that sort of thing for Peterson, it's like God is truth manifested, because there's a lot of times when it's like lies will manifest, and you've got to be able to check it and say, okay, why is that a lie? Okay, so like we should have free speech and nonviolence are like some examples of high principles. And so if there's a movement that is anti-free speech and pro-violence, then that's a good indication that that movement is at least misguided. So yeah, I mean, it's I don't know if we want to get a little bit more back.
For me, it's the same. Either it's against free speech, or it's for it, or like you said, because the way that Gandhi and Martin Luther King did it, it's through conformity. This is sort of like the new man. You should be more compassionate and not see people by their color. You should see them by their character, by their personality, right? Judge them by their. So it's a new way of looking at things. So he was basically trying to convert people by these speeches. But any form of conversion or any form of conformity is a form of violence, in my opinion. Conformity is violence.
Okay, that's an interesting point. But and I just I posted a short video of Martin Luther King Jr. speaking in an interview, just like 5 minutes earlier today, and he made a really interesting point that I could look up the quote, but in that little interview, but basically the main weapon of an oppressed people is organized nonviolence, and you want to organize your nonconformity. So you want to protest, and you want to be, and like you can call that a form of violence, but I mean then you get into definitional issues to where you want to, because they had the right to be violent, and so a lot of the people even today protesting that have kind of like been given the right to be violent because of what they've been through. But if you sacrifice that right, or that feeling, or that urge, or that you're justified in doing so, then that's where it's like you get to a higher result, where it's, I mean, it's kind of like the turning the other cheek principle, where, if you punch me in the face and then I'm not going to let you beat me to death, but if I say, hey, I forgive you because you're not being yourself, when really I could have punched you in the face back, or I sort of had been given that right, so to speak, then I gained the upper hand. So same thing with those who choose to be non-conformist, so they don't conform to the evil authority or the evil culture or the wrong culture, but they do so in a nonviolent way. And this is all just kind of going on the principle of how ideas and culture affects each other and changes over time. And it's about how it's played out, And I don't know if we want to try to get more back on the more literal way of understanding God, but it's similar in how that things play out, because we're dealing with these invisible principles, and it's sort of like we're living out mythologies, or we're living out stories, even though you can't objectively say what some of these things are. But it's like, sometimes Jordan Peterson gives the example of if you bear your suffering rather than whining about it, then the more people do that, the closer they get to, he'll use the terminology of the city of God, which is more of like an internal state. And so it's the same thing with everything that we deal with every day. We could whine and complain about it. We might have the right to, or the rationality to, but if we take that suffering and do something to achieve a higher goal, then we don't only probably achieve that higher goal, but maybe on a delayed gratification kind of way, but also it builds up the internal state of the individuals doing so.
You're talking about a moral high ground, a value principle, which many people don't have. So,
they don't have it necessarily naturally, but so it's like this. You have people like young people, whether they're at universities or they're just upset protesters for whatever reason, and they have that right to do all those different things, protest, maybe even be violent, or you could say that they've kind of been given that right because of how they were treated or whatever. But when we see what the result is of just rioting, looting without any clear goals on how to achieve what you're actually after, sometimes it's like I think of it of the principle of the prodigal son. If you let somebody go out and do whatever that they want, the prodigal son, and it's a parable by Jesus for those of you may not know it. It's like a young guy got his whole inheritance from his father. He went out and spent it all partying, and then he was basically ruined his life, and he's like just surviving by working with the pigs and eating what the pigs eat. But that principle is just, it's almost like what liberalism or liberal humanism can do is if you give people so much infinite freedom, there's going to be some people that will be responsible with that freedom and have, I don't know if the terminology, if the terminology is right to say moral high ground, but you could say some people act on higher values or higher morality and are better off initially. But other people, they go out and they fuck shit up, whatever. They go and screw up their lives. They go and they loot and riot. And then at some point, and I think to some degree our people are going through right now, as you see, like they've gone through all the looting and rioting and haven't really gained anything from it other than, a little bit of cultural shift, but not much progress other than that. And it's not even that, because it's like, okay, the cultural shift that they gained, it's like nobody looked at George Floyd dying unless it's like one in a billion people that are like, an actual Nazi, nobody looked at George Floyd dying and been like, yeah, awesome. Everybody's like, yeah, that's horrible. So it's not like what they're protesting. There's like half the country being like, oh, well, that, N-word should have got it. Like, nobody's doing that. So it's kind of like, okay, people can go out and do whatever that they want. And at some point, they should, maybe they won't admit it because they want to stay on their moral low ground, you might say, but they should start saying, how can we really make this right? And that's the process of maturing. If you go out and do the wrong thing, eventually that's kind of like the prodigal son example. You go back and like, how should I do what's right? And you start to try to find how to do what's right.
That's basically meditation. It's thinking about what you're going to do.
Yeah, but even if you don't necessarily meditate, life should speak to you where it's like, okay, I felt like going out and looting and rioting would get me what I want, and it didn't. It just made me feel horrible. So how do I really get what I want? And yeah, you could call that meditation because they listen to the reflection of their conscience or whatever. But life is going to speak to people. And sometimes I've given the example of how, Nietzsche. What's that?
Life will speak to people. They never listen. Everyone knows what's good and bad.
Well, not initially necessarily. And so
you
that's
learn
why
pretty quickly.
You learn pretty quickly. And sometimes that's why drugs and alcohol are such a thing, because it helps numb your conscience and it helps numb your sort of like gnawing self that wants to really do the right thing. And there's a lot, and that's why people get into addictions, and not just chemical addictions, but entertainment, even gambling and workaholic type things. It's because it helps, because your conscience and your like inner self is always going to be gnawing away, saying like, how could I do better? How, like, this can't be the only way. How do I get better? And you have to go through a sacrificial process to really mature, but most people don't want to make that journey, so they numb themselves instead. And so that's why, and to kind of like bring that to our principle that we're getting at, the battle of the gods sort of idea, is that war is kind of going on inside everybody all the time to some degree, however conscious of it they may or may not be, of like these ideas. And we're kind of the ultimate judge of, or each individual is, of what's going to win and what's going to prevail and what's not. And it is a taxing battle either way. So you can resist it and try to like numb it and bring it down, whether you do that through addictions or just being a workaholic, or there's all kinds of things you can do to try to run from that inner guide, inner feeling, conscience, or that draw towards maturity. But that's where the gods are trying to come out, and maybe not necessarily literal gods, but those higher order principles are trying to nest themselves in the lived reality through individuals.
Even the Christians or many other religions have this idea of there being an inner battle of good and evil, which is going on for our souls, the Christians say, or others, for immortal life or whatever. But this battle exists, and I think everyone is aware of it. And I think people who do bad things, or criminals, they know they're doing bad things. And people who do good things, they know they're doing good things, and they don't expect anything in return.
Well, yes to no. I would say on that, if you, and so this is an example of sort of like how the battle can go towards getting better on an individual and cultural basis, or getting worse. So it's like if you go interview or talk to people in in jails, or criminals, or gang members, or whatever, something like 90% of them will justify their actions. and they'll say that they had some justification, whether it was like, I needed to protect my family, or the government's wrong, or people are screwing people over, or whatever. Even if it wasn't like a one-time thing, like, oh, I killed that guy because of this and this, and he deserved it. But it was like they were, serial killers will often have some kind of a justification, even. And and which is that tricky battle where it's like, if we're not careful, we can go to one side and justify our devil that's manifesting, you could call it, and then on the other hand, you could go the other way. Your shadow too, and you can. That's the thing, is because on one hand, you like are justifying your shadow / devil. On the other hand, to go to those higher level principles, it's a act of surrender and sacrifice. So that's why most people will either go the bad way, so to speak, or they'll just constantly teeter in the middle. And that's that battle, and which is, to the
important thing for me, the way I see it, is you can't be balanced. You can't just stay in the middle. It's like a very sharp knife, and it's something, when it falls, it has to fall either one side or the other. It can't balance itself on the knife. So no one is perfectly balanced between good and evil. All this integration and all these people who tell me, oh, I'm equally good and evil. No, you should be good. You should cut the evil and stay with the good, because it's bad. So stop lying and all that. It's not doing you any.
There is that principle of sort of like the because good and evil are just judgments. You can call anything good, you can call anything evil.
Personal judgments.
And there's some things that over time, however many decades or centuries or millennia ago, it looked like there were certain things that were good and whatever, but we were wrong for whatever reason. And then on the other hand, there might have been other things that we thought were evil and they're not so bad. And so the good and evil are kind of this judgment we're constantly making. But I guess the way that makes sense to that people want to say that they're balanced, that they're good and evil. It's just that they accept themselves and reality for what it is, which I think is it's an honest approach, in that everybody is both. We're all a measure of good and evil. And if we say, okay, this part of me is kind of good and I should do more of that, and this part of me is kind of bad and I should do less of that, that's kind of a mature thing. But everybody's different with that, and it really comes down to an individual's relationship with themselves and then reality, or others.
I think naturally we're more evil than good, actually, because if you believe the evolution theory, right, we're more animal, we're more animalistic than we are saint-like, most of us, right?
Yeah, although I would say that's true, but the maturation process, I believe, is natural. The process to become more, I don't know if you want to call it enlightened or just mature or more saintly, as you might say, I believe that's natural, that over time we see right from wrong, and it's unnatural to like justify violence. I mean, there might be rare cases, self-defense and certain things, but there's some things that you just can't justify, but people do so anyway, whether it's for their tribalism or their cause or whatever.
Maybe violence, like you said, can be used in self-defense, but take anger. Can you ever justify being angry at someone? I see no reason to. I've learned not find a reason to justify it. I used to be angry at people. Now, what does it get you?
Like, okay, there's I mean, that's a big subject, like where like, okay, those who have had anger issues, loss of control because of their anger, then usually what they'll get is they'll have to learn not anger elimination, but they'll learn anger management, which is really important because, yeah, you can have that perspective of what does it get you and all that, but there's still going to be things that can and should make you angry. And so it's more about controlling it and managing it so that instead of getting angry and losing control, and that's sort of the subject of, like, you know, shadow work or shadow integration, where rather than never being angry, taking your anger and using it for good. Sometimes I give the example, and this I kind of like the Hulk, you know, the Incredible Hulk mythology, where towards the end, whether that's, I don't know at what point in the movies or comic books or whatever, you know, his whole thing was he becomes this monster that he tries to control for like a hero, but it's because he'll lose control with his anger. And so a lot of his whole hero's journey, so to speak, of the internal battle is learning to control his anger. And then where he kind of like transcends it isn't that he says, I'm never angry anymore. It's that he says, I'm angry all the time. And then he'll either not be the Hulk, or he will always be the Hulk, or depending on where the story is, he'll be able to control his, you know, transformation. And
the sticky monster approach. Alan Watts likes to call this the sticky monster approach. How do you fight a monster when you punch it, your punch sticks to it, and every move you do, you get closer to it instead of repulsing it, right? You have to hug the monster, like Hulk hugged his anger.
Yeah.
He said, I'll embrace my anger rather than you know, renounce it.
Right. And I think that's a really important principle. Sometimes I'll say, you know, like, I feel like people are often on edge and they think they're going crazy and they're always afraid to go crazy, you know, especially in strange times like we've had this year. And sometimes I'll make the joke, which is half serious, or maybe more than a little more than half serious, where it's like, instead of just being on the edge of losing your shit all the time, just lose your shit once and for all, and know that your shit has been lost, and then you won't be then, you know, we're all kind of crazy. And it's kind of that same principle of like, hey, we're all a little pissed off, so just admit that everybody's kind of pissed off and crazy, and then you can deal with it, which kind of is kind of that concept of repression. If you're always like, no, I'm not crazy, everybody else is crazy, anybody but me, crazy people are crazy, I'm not crazy, I'm not angry, I'm only happy, I'm a good person, everything to do is good, then that causes that repression. And then sometimes that leads to, when that repression comes out, it leads to people doing things that they regret or that they can't excuse, but they have to try to, you know.
I think in the 60s there was this idea that if everyone does LSD or mushrooms, the world will change, you know. People won't shoot each other, won't be any more wars, all that.
Or anything. There won't be any more anything. Everybody will just go crazy and or die. Now every time we get on this subject, it's like, where's Connor?
Yeah, I was about to say.
That's Connor's subject. And I was hoping to get on here maybe in the next week or so. We'll have one where we can focus on that subject more and hopefully get him and BJ on, because that's their thing.
Oh, gosh, I'll get double.
Yeah, I don't know. What do you think about these things, Jonathan?
A question came to mind, Radu. You said that you think humans are more naturally inclined for evil, rather than good. And your argument was, well, we're animals, we evolved, so we have a lot of evolutionary baggage like tribalism and violence and etc. And that's a great point, and it's an important one to keep in mind. So, what would you say is the origin of the feeling, for example, of if you see a child in danger, you instinctively know to go help it. If you see an old lady trying to cross the
You named
street.
it. It's instinct. It's instinct.
Okay, right. So that means some instincts that we inherit are problematic and some are good.
Right.
Of course.
So wouldn't that then say that we're not intrinsically good or evil? We have good and evil instincts, and like the battle of the gods, the job is for us to overcome the bad instincts.
I perfectly agree. I was just when I was putting this comparison in my mind, I was thinking of our potential, which we can achieve, and what we are now.
Okay.
So that's what I was comparing. So I think we can do a lot more. Not that we're that bad, compared to other apes. We're pretty good, but I think we can do much better as human beings.
Absolutely.
I think we have done much better in the past, and now we're regressing, I think.
How would you say that we're regressing?
Well, I think the best time to be alive was before World War One, because after war wars, the national consciousness of human beings turned into a more of a global consciousness, and everything turned into a mishmash. Back then, people had the real religion. Like they would find it not by going to a priest, but they had a personal relationship. And now it doesn't exist anymore. All those things that existed in human consciousness back then have slowly eroded and are eroding at a faster pace as we speaking with globalization and all this movement of people.
I don't know. That's a weird. I don't know if I'd say weird, but it's a tricky point to make, because I would say in a lot of ways we have made a lot of different types of progress. Materialistically, it's very easy to say that we've constantly been making progress, especially for the last, I don't know, few hundred years, in terms of having more wealth, more material goods, less pain, less suffering, less. We've been progressing toward, in the physical material aspect, towards, and it's tricky too, because I feel like this generation of the 21st century that we're now in, sometimes if you just like look at the news or the media, it can look like the worst times ever. But I think in a lot of ways, it's weird, because it's like, in some ways it's the best times ever, because it's the most peaceful and prosperous, and at least in materialistic ways. Now, in terms of like consciousness and religious ideas and those kind of things, yeah, you could say that was a little different 100, 200 years ago, maybe 300 years ago, and maybe it could have been better in some ways, assuming you could stay alive and all that, because it was 300 years ago, the average lifespan was something like 50 or 60 if you're lucky. It may have been better in some ways, because also, like, now we have a lot of trouble with drug addiction and suicide and those type of things, and even like obesity related things cause more death than starvation. So we've got new problems, but the thing is, whether you're in, sometimes it's hard to judge like third world countries, but for the most part, whatever part of the world that you're in, you've got unlimited potential to go out and have access to so much knowledge and books and people and everything else, to where you can still develop all that consciousness that you want to on an individual level, or you can chase whatever rabbit hole you want, whether that's more materialistic or whatever. And then the other way that I kind of make the distinction too is, I forget the exact timeline, and he got away, but okay. So I'll just wrap up this idea and see if he comes back. But as you go back in time, about 100, 200 years ago, 300 years ago for sure, we were always stuck population-wise of where we'd only get to like a 500 million or 1 billion people in the whole world. And so now it's like, I would say of this generation-ish, we've got 7 billion or so in the world, but I would say that there's at least 500 million or 1 billion people that are in, I don't know if I'd say a more enlightened state, or at least a more mature state compared to the 500 million or 1 billion people that were there 200 or 300 years ago. So now you just have a lot more stuff, and some of it is going to be good stuff and bad stuff and confusing stuff, but that's kind of what we're going through, is figuring that out. But anyway, I'd like to hear a little bit more from you, Jonathan. Maybe we'll start to wrap it up and see if we can get anywhere on this idea.
Yeah, we're on the hour 30 mark. I would disagree that we've regressed, net regression from let's say 1900. It's interesting that he said right before World War I, because there was almost certainly a steep regression from right before World War I to right after the atomic bombs were dropped. That was that was probably the worst time to be alive for most of the world. If you're Jewish, if you're Japanese, if you're anyone, that was a terrible time to be alive. The Cold War after that, progress was slow.
Right.
But I'm sort of, I'm what Jordan Peterson would call an enlightenment type. I respect the bloody history of humanity, but
that's important.
But rape is down, murder's down. Right. If you look at all the statistics of things we would want to reduce, they're all slowly reducing. So I would say this is the best time to be alive. There is something to say there, which is that we've created new challenges for ourselves by being so wise and technologically advanced. The whole, what do we do with the police? What do we do with government size? Reducing the government. What do we do with technology and global, the carbon emissions? How do we fix that in a way that doesn't, make the government too strong, but also gets the job done? We've created a lot of different problems than people in the 1900s would have lived with. And so that's one of the biggest reasons we need to have the value discussion is it looks very different.
And I would say on that line too is, okay, I really agree with that. But especially in that all of our things that we regret as humanity, whether you want to say both world wars, the Cold War, everything else, that sucks that those things happen, to put it in its, whatever the most simple thing. The most simple thing you could say, I guess. But the fact is, it happened, and because that it did, we're now in the 21st century. We're dealing with that on our conscience, and it's more good than bad, I think. More the fact that the atrocities happen of those wars and everything else makes us want to be better and do better than it makes us want to, be evil or do evil.
We learned our lesson from it, let's say.
Yes, although I would just say that we're learning our lesson from it. Because and part of that, like I say, is like, if you have those issues or you have those things that you're upset about in our culture, we want to continue to learn things like have free speech and nonviolence and all those things.
Yeah, we still haven't completely learned the lesson. People calling everyone who they see a Nazi, right?
Right.
Yeah, we still have a little bit more to learn on that. So yeah, that's right.
Yeah, we've got a little ways to come, but we're making progress. And I would just say, as we start to wrap this up, that I don't know, kind of what we're getting at is that, and I was hoping to have again Connor with us. He's always teasing us like he's going to get on, and then he doesn't. I don't know if it's like a publicity game that he's playing or what.
He's playing hard to get, so that when he does come on, we'll be so appreciative that we'll agree with everything.
Like, tell us how it is, bro. But we
have to talk about today, though. So maybe we'll have to relegate the next one to him and BJ, because I know those two are going to have the same thing to say, and they have a lot to say. So,
well, and I guess my thing. Okay, so like my perspective, I guess it's similar to yours in the whole. It's similar it's similar, but the opposite in a way, in that I look at the complexity of these issues and I say, because of those same things that you say, it's super complex and all these things, and it's hard to define it and put your finger on it. But we've still been wrestling with it for millennia, and probably will for millennia, and do so more and more in different ways all the time. Shows us that maybe we need to redo our approach to it, but that it's always going to be a battle to have, and there's not going to be like a set way to look at it, or a set like this is how to get it done. But we've always got to try to take in all the perspectives that we can. Almost like, I was saying earlier, like if you take 1,000 people and you say, describe this sunset right now, and write down what this was, and some will just describe it physically, some will say how it made them feel. And if you look at that 1,000 people description, it's all real. All 1,000 perspectives are real. And that's kind of like some of these issues of what gods are. Some more good gods or true gods, and some more false gods or even deceptive evil type gods. Maybe not in a literal metaphysical way. In that that's all like a spectrum of reality. If you like describe anything that's just subjective, it's all a real thing and real stuff. But then it's a matter of figuring out how to put that into practice and reality in the best way. So,
well, maybe we can end on this last question, which is something that I wanted to bring up when Radu said it, but it sort of the conversation got derailed slightly, which is, he said that God isn't something that science can pin down or logic can define precisely. It's something you have to experience, right? And I think Connor might really enjoy hearing that, because he's with the whole DMT thing and whatnot. But one of the things that Radu said immediately after that is that we can't trust our senses. And so that's sort of true. We didn't evolve to have the most precise senses to being attuned to the nature of the universe. We evolved to survive. So the question is, if we should be skeptical of our senses, how can we be certain of experiences? Because those two things seem to be sort of opposed to each other.
Yeah, and okay, we talked about this a little bit before, and that in some of our recent talks on this, so I think some of them you were involved in, some not, but it's that, okay, we have our foundational axioms of and they could be anything. I think we talked about this last time. We have our foundational axioms, and then we put those into practice through our value structure. And the way that you put those into practice, it's to achieve an aim. The foundation and the moral structure is just like this bucket of gooey mess if it doesn't have a solid aim. And that's where people are often misled and confused, especially like, younger people. Not everyone, like a university teacher, for example, but a lot of younger people that are just like, okay, I got to go out and, make money, and they get very materialistic, when, that's not an evil thing, but it's lower on the value structure. Whereas like your higher value structure is going to be to more like be the best human you can be, and help the world be the best world of humanity that it can be. And then as you progress towards that goal, and of course you could get a lot more into the details of that, then you will see the benefits of it, and you're going to have to make certain sacrifices to achieve those aims, and that will sometimes delay gratification compared to just going after money and materialism and all those type of things. So I say that because that's kind of what experience is in the test of experience. To your question a minute ago, to where so I'm trying to think of an example. So sometimes it's easiest to make business analogies, I think. So like in a business, we want to say that's a little bit different, because we want to say, okay, the measure of success for a business is if it can maintain profitability. So if you're going to put a business in the market, the free market, and figure out if it is going to be successful or a failure, is going to be if it maintains profitability or goes bankrupt after so many months or years. Now, that is really easy and empirical to see as far as if a business is successful or not. And that's sort of like the experience of a business, is that business experienced failure, and you can like look at some bankrupt business and try to say why, and then look at some successful businesses and try to say why, and there's a lot of literature on that. Now, for a human being, it's more like a human becoming, like I said, sort of like maybe this is part of why that people like Radu might say that we have less of a good culture now, is because it's less family oriented. Because the easiest way that you can definitely say that person, like an individual person, is a good person, like most sort of empirically, is to look at how their grandchildren turn out. Like that's like the ultimate experience, is to say they were not only good at being a person, but they produced people that were good people. And that's kind of like the ultimate, I guess, litmus test for experience. And then Radu's back, so maybe we can
Hey guys.
Jonathan, why don't you briefly pose that question to Radu, and then we'll start to wrap it up.
Okay, so I was asking something to Isaac that I heard you say earlier, but the conversation sort of drowned it out. And it was that you made two claims, and I'll make sure I'm quoting these correctly. You said first that God is something you have to experience. You can't define it or do science on it. You have to experience the divine.
Yes.
And the second thing you said was, and I think this was getting it towards the sort of weaknesses in science, is that science, because our senses can't be trusted, there's weaknesses in the scientific endeavor or whatnot. Our senses are flawed, right?
Yes.
So my question is, how can you trust your experiences if your senses aren't always accurate?
You don't.
Okay. So wouldn't
you shouldn't.
So wouldn't that imply that the divine experiences are always subjective and therefore questionable?
Yes. I try to say that. I try to say, because they're archetypal, because they should be archetypal, because every person should find its own meaning. That's why it's archetypal. It's like the lyrics of a song. They don't say about your girlfriend, but you add that into the lyrics as if it's talking about your person,
Yeah.
So when you think about a concept which is so high as God, which is a prime mover or all-knowing and all that, you need that concept to intervene between your limited perspective and the world, which is truth. Because in most religions, we have a distinction between truth and reality, right? Reality is what we measure. It's called Maya, right? Illusion. And the word Maya comes from the root meaning measurement. When you measure something, you make it finite. You make it into a bite-sized thing, which you can understand with your limited perspective. But the world is a whole. And you can never understand the world by taking parts of it, bits of it, and understanding each bit and putting it together.
Yeah, like levels of resolution.
So could I maybe one more thing? Are you not a materialist?
No.
Okay, yeah. I think
Well,
you wouldn't be. Yeah.
This body is it can go away. It's fine.
Right.
Yeah, we don't even. That's the tricky thing too, is that we can't ever know for sure, even what the body is. You know, like even Elon Musk makes that point. Sometimes statistically, it's most likely that we're in a simulation, and if we're not, then consciousness like ours could be. And that's the really interesting thing is that okay, there's only certain things that we can know. So like we can't even know for sure. We can know the rules of our what seems to be our physical existence. So like we can know um maybe not completely know understand the all that is light and gravity and everything else that makes up our physical world, but we can know enough to behave in it and operate in it. And it's kind of like the game theory in that the rules of this game of life are we know enough that we can know how to like be on the right path, be on the path that will make us more better people, to put it simply. We can know the concepts and principles and values or whatever you want to call it that'll help us be better people and have better experience in this world. And I would just say on that point too that the thing to be careful of in these discussions and things, like you were saying a minute ago, we can't even completely trust our experiences, or we have to question them. That's true, but the thing that we're always trying to be careful of on both ends, hey, we disappeared again, is one is the moral relativism is to be careful of, to where on one side we don't want to be like, what's the point, we can't really know anything about morality or right and wrong. Then the other hand, we don't want to get to the other extreme where it's like, okay, we know these are the absolute things, so we have to like totalitarian style enforce them. So it's more like finding that balance between order and chaos, and always kind of updating that. And I think we'll just about wrap it up. So I don't know if you have anything else to mention on those lines before we wrap it up, and we'll do this again probably next week.
Yeah, I think it's a good topic to end on is our experiences and our senses, because when Connor comes on here, I know he's gonna go on all over that. So it'll be fun.
All right. Well, hopefully Connor gets his stuff together.
We're gonna have a home celebration for him next time.
Yeah, we'll talk, and maybe I don't know if it has to be. I think Zoom is a little better for mobile, because I think sometimes he has issues with his laptop, and but he can jump on the mobile version. But we'll figure it out. And cool. Well, at least we got some things done today. We made some progress, evolution, whatever, and we'll do it again probably in about a week.
All righty. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks a lot, Jonathan, and Radu out there in the cloud or whatever, and anybody else watching. So see you later. All right.